Often when starting something new, it can be tempting to want to improve really fast. And when you're just beginning, you may actually make a lot of improvements quickly because there's so many question marks, so many unknowns, and just so many things that you don't know how to do yet. So for example, if you've never drawn before and you just start, in your first 2 weeks of drawing, you'll know a lot more than you did at the start because there's so much low-hanging fruit, right? So much that's easier for a beginner to obtain. But say you've been drawing for 5 years and you've already learned much of those beginning things. In another 2 weeks after those 5 years, you might not learn much because, again, you've already gotten that low-hanging fruit and learned those beginner things. And so this unbalanced learning can really distort how we see growth. We may be used to having constant wins early on, but as time goes on, those wins may come less and less often. And so this leads me to my first major point, which is that the trajectory of growth may not be as linear as we think it is or as we want it to be. It's tempting to think of growth as a linear, sequential, and even predictable path forward, but most of the time, that's just not the case. It's usually not as simple as just going from point A to point B, right? Oftentimes there are detours, bumps in the roads, or setbacks. So more often than not, growth isn't just a straight line from start to finish, but rather a much more complex, unpredictable series of lines. So something that may look more like this. And so my point here is that growth isn't always clear and straightforward. So when we see it through this skewed lens of the linear path or trajectory, we might be giving ourselves unrealistic expectations, which can then fuel our feelings that we're not going anywhere or we're not learning or growing. But the fact is, growth is a much more unpredictable and confusing path. A path without a map or guides. A path that only you can travel. Another reason why we might not see growth is because we haven't zoomed out far enough. We simply may not have been able to pull back our perspective enough, or maybe we're too zoomed in or focused on our own work. For example, what I mean by this is if you make a painting and you feel like it's not a great painting and maybe you have like a series of work that isn't the greatest, you might start to feel like, why aren't I learning, right? Why aren't I improving? It could be because you just simply aren't looking far back enough to where you were previously. So if you really zoom out and see where you were 2 or 3 years ago, and you look at your art from back then, you may find that you've grown a lot, or at least a lot more than you think you have. You just haven't been able to zoom out enough to see it. And often that can be really reassuring to see that you actually have grown a lot, to look back and see how far you've come. So once you can actually see that growth that you've made, it can be a very encouraging thing for you to keep going. But remember, it takes time. Growth takes a while. And if you're learning a new skill, it may take years before you even start to feel like you know what you're doing. And so you may not be able to see those true, real, visible parts of the growth until years later. And that leads me into another point, which is the type of growth. Not all growth is visual. Not all growth is detectable by the eye, right? So just because your art doesn't look vastly different doesn't mean you haven't grown. And that's an important thing. So for one, the thing I mentioned earlier, how you gauge the trajectory of growth can determine how you think of growth. But how do you even decide what growth looks like? Does it look like a more polished painting? Well, in some cases, yes, but growth could also be how you think about your paintings. It could be how your workflow goes, it could be how your mindset, your overall general mindset about your art is. Is it more positive now, or is it still in a negative place? Growth is a very complicated and nuanced thing, and it's not something that should be boxed into just superficial or just visual improvements. So if you're learning and growing, that doesn't only mean your finished art is becoming better. It could also very well mean that you're becoming a better artist in general, and that doesn't always immediately equate to better looking art. Another point why you might not be seeing growth is because you're stuck with bad or old habits. And this is a big point because if you're stuck in a routine doing the same thing every day and you're not seeing growth, it could very well mean that your habits or workflow are not efficient or just not conducive to growth. And so if you can evaluate what you're doing, maybe what you're practicing, for example, are you studying from reference? Are you practicing fundamentals? Are you learning from, different, whether it be different videos or different courses, whatever the case may be? Are you actively trying to practice? Are you putting in the time? Or are you stuck in a space of comfort? Are you in a comforting complacency, right? This complacent routine? Because if you are, then you're not really going to grow. You can be comfortable at a certain point and you can stay at that certain point forever. So I'd say it's a good idea to change things up, maybe try a new workflow, or even try to learn the fundamentals again, or for the first time, because maybe it's your fundamentals that are lacking. You might want to go back to the basics and remind yourself of the core structured elements of creating art. And a lot of times that can be a good way to refocus your work and to help you see more growth in some areas that may be lacking. Which leads me to the next point, which is that maybe you're not seeing growth because there's some areas of your work that are lacking or that could be improved. And in that case, it's a good idea to try to identify what those areas are. So for example, if you feel like your line work could use improvements, well then try to practice your line work. Maybe look at some educational videos or learn from other artists that you like, and just try to dive into improving that one aspect. And once you improve your line work and you feel like it's better, try to find another area of your work that could be improved. So for example, maybe your lighting and shadows need to be improved, or your rendering, or maybe your composition or perspective. Now, all of these are things that you can identify, isolate, and improve one at a time. So instead of feeling, oftentimes it can feel overwhelming, like there's so many things that we need to learn at once. But if you try to break it down into actionable tasks, simple actionable steps or items that you can improve, it can really take the complexity and overwhelming factor out of the growth and improving. So try and isolate those things and work on them one at a time so you don't feel overwhelmed, and so that you're able to clearly know that I'm improving because my line work looks better. Now that my line work looks better, let's work on shadows and lighting and so on. And this is, of course, if you're going for visual improvement in your art. And lastly, maybe the most important thing from this video is that everybody grows at different paces. So if you're comparing yourself to the one person who you think grew and improved very quickly, you'll be doing yourself a disservice because you're not that person. On top of that, you don't have what they have. But at the same time, they don't have what you have. So embrace that. Embrace the difference and the individuality, and realize that everybody goes at their own pace. Remember that it's not a race, but rather a marathon. And if you start to treat it as if it's a race, that's when you're going to start skipping steps and important learning opportunities. And that's when you're going to start getting frustrated because of the lack of growth. So remember that everybody goes at their own pace, and this takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. But as long as you're trying to improve and grow, and as long as you're searching for ways to do that, then you will grow and you will improve. It may be months or it may be years, but it just takes time. So stick with it, have patience, and enjoy the process, because it's a long and difficult process. But if you're passionate about it, and if you love what you do, it's a worthwhile process. So thanks for watching. And as always, stay creative.